A Lantern, Chapter 20. And now Christine had to pull Abby out of the drift and put forth all her effort to get the suffering woman to retrace her steps to the little front gate. She did not dare turn into the wide-open gateway and run the risk of losing her bearings in the uncharted wilderness of the lane road. In the added fear of her childbirth warnings, Abby clung to Christine with all her strength. "Oh, Christine, I can't go any farther." The storm god took the words and threw them back in her face. "Come, you!" Christine hurled savagely into Abby's ear. "Of your man tink! Of your kinder tink! You're verrekt crazy!" Christine kept her freezing right arm through Abby's and, plunging slowly ahead, grasped every picket with her left. Pausing, cowering, plunging, pulling Abby's half-prostrate body, she came to the welcome crosspieces of the small gate. "By de cedars vitel," she called in Abby's ear. They turned blindly, for all directions seemed lost in the mad whirl of snow, crawled through the gateway, and grasped the first cedar. "How many?" Christine was calling. "9," Abby moaned. She held on to the last far-reaching branch of the first cedar while Christine felt for the second. "Zwei!" Pushing on, cowering before the white smother, they crawled. The storm tore Abby's shawl from her, and the frozen icicles of her wet hair beat her face like tiny razor blades. "Drei!" As she felt Christine pulling her forward, the hideous, agonizing childbirth pain shook her freezing body again, and she sank into a wildly whirling drift. "Du nar!" Christine snarled at her ear. "Come! Du nar! Fool!" She set her teeth and plunged ahead while the icy needles drew something moist and trickling from her face. "Wir!" Now her breath was going. One could not struggle on when there was no air to breathe. Christine was pulling her because she had no breath. Christine was pulling her. "Fumph!" Abby sank to her knees in pain. Christine jerked at her fiercely. "Get you up!" In her ear, Christine was yelling. "You die! You like that dying, maybe, Nine? Your baby! You kill him! You like that, killing your baby, maybe?" No, she must not kill her baby. So she must do as Christine said, but it was so painful. "Setch!" Abby began to be too numb to feel the cold. What was the use of obeying Christine? Christine had no right to boss so. "Sieben!" The white, suffocating smother was turning dark. There seemed to be no use fighting the hideous black thing that was closing her breath. "Act!" Christine was pushing and dragging her. She ought to help Christine push and drag. "9!" Together they plunged to the wall of the house. By the loyal cedars they had found their way, in a war of snow when the whole world was fighting in mortal combat. Only the cedars seemed not to have lost their heads. Only Abby Cedars and Christine seemed faithful to her. Abby knew that Christine was dragging her now into the warm shelter of the house. She heard Christine say something about "Heiß Water, quick!" And then she tumbled into a sea of suffering to which there was no shore and which time was not measured. It was hard to breathe. Sometimes she saw faces dimly which came and went. Sometimes she vaguely heard whisperings. Sometimes she smelled steamy woolens and moist hot flannels. Most of the time, she was sinking under cold, smothering water. Only one thing brought her back. A light. A lantern shining down into the icy waters. It shone to light the way back up for her. Each time she sank, she kept her eyes on the light and said, "Will, Mac, Margaret, John, Isabel," and the saying of the names bore her back to the surface and the light. And then in some queer intuitive way, she knew her life was going out with the tide. The light grew fainter and farther away. She did not care especially, except for one thing, the light. She ought not to lose sight of its faint gleam. Some tiny spark of memory kept reminding her that she must never take her eyes away from the far-off glow of the lantern. So that sinking, She kept pulling herself feebly back towards its faint gleam with Will, Mac, Margaret, John, Isabel. She told the words over as a nun touches her beads. Her mind was not lucid enough to understand that through constant utterance she was trying to pray that she might come back to her responsibility, that she had so much to do yet for the family, that they could not get along without her. Over and over she said them. Will, Mac, Margaret, John, Isabel. Each name a bead, each bead a prayer. And when her mind cleared a little and she heard a strange new wail, she remembered a new responsibility and said them over again. Will, Mac, Margaret, John, Isabel, the baby. Each name a bead, each bead a prayer. Fighting the icy waters feebly, with only the thought of the light to keep them from closing over her, she came back at times to the consciousness of the homely red face of Christine by her bed, nodding, jerking up, nodding. And when the light grew clearer and more steady, and the cold waters seemed gone, Will told her that the baby was a girl. We'll name her Grace, Abby said feebly. Grace of God, she'll be a comfort. She'll stay with us longer, maybe than a boy. Where's Christine, Will? Christine Reinmuller came in to stand by the bed, her short, shapeless body in a blue calico dress, the greasy tight braids of her hair wound flat from ear to ear, her fat red face scarred with scratches. Abby reached up and pulled her down. Arms close around her, she kissed her rough cheek. Christine, my friend for all my life. Christine writhed in embarrassment. Ach, du sans garage, foolish. She pulled away. I did's nichts, nothing. It seemed odd to Abby to have a baby again after 10 years. Sometimes she said she was afraid she'd forgotten how to care for one. But when she grew strong, it all came back to her. The Abby Deals do not forget. Margaret graduated from the academy in the spring of that year. Fred Baker, the minister's nephew, who was to be a full-fledged doctor in 1 more year, arrived in time for the graduating exercises and brought her a stereoscope with the views of Niagara Falls, Hudson's Bay by moonlight, the wedding party, and several others with subtle suggestions of a romantic nature. Margaret rode home in the lumber wagon with the stereoscopic views in her lap and her head somewhere beyond the prairie clouds. John went back to the academy in the fall, but Margaret was at home with Abby for the year, and that year was to seem very short to Abby, for Margaret was getting ready to marry the embryonic doctor. And as all the estate, real or personal, which the two owned consisted of the stereoscopic and the 12 picturesque romantic views, the year was crowded with the making of quilts, the hemming of sheets, and the sewing of carpet rags. The next spring, Abby's dream of a parlor came into the world of reality. They built it on the south side of the old part, protruding toward the road. They wanted it done before Margaret's wedding, and the wedding was already set for June. Old Daisy Drum, a little more stooped and silent and tobacco-stained, finished the last door latch and the last piece of mopboard several weeks before the momentous occasion. John and Will painted the pine exterior, and Abby and Margaret varnished the pine interior. There were 2 modish details about the parlor which Abby was inordinately proud. The fan-shaped colored glass window toward the road, and the double doors that slipped mysteriously into the wall when pushed backwards. To be sure, in looking through the fan-shaped glass, one saw a bilious green sky, a sickly yellow cedars, a waving blue picket fence, and a nightmarish red lawn. But this was a mere bagatelle beside the touch of the distinction it gave. Also, the doors, after mysteriously disappearing into the walls, could not always be coaxed readily out of their hiding places, so that the womenfolk would have to call John or Father to come help us, will you? Abby was proud of them, though, and all her life made loyal excuses. for the doors sticking just a little today. Abby and Margaret rode up to Lincoln on the branch line with its small engine, its one coach and baggage car, and bought a red and green sail carpet for the new parlor. Nottingham curtains, an oak patent swinging rocker, and a marble-top stand with a blue plush album. It seemed too much grandeur at one time for a single family to acquire. Abby's rather critical conscience reminded her constantly that Rome was at the height of its glory just before the fall. She sewed the strips of carpet together, and then the united family put it down over a layer of newspapers and fresh oat straw. Will, Abby, and John crawled along one side of the room on their hands and knees, pulling and stretching and tacking, while Margaret kept the straw pushed down as level as she could so the result would not be Rocky Mountain-like. And Isabel kept little Grace, a year and a half old now, from putting the tacks into her mouth. When these two stupendous tasks were accomplished and the carpet was taut and springy over its oat field, they put up the curtains, moved in the organ and the whatnot, Abby's old painting of the prairie, the new chair and the stand, the blue plush album, and the stereopticon views, which luckily were to remain in the parlor through the wedding. Surveying the finished product, Abby wondered if any of the Astors or Vanderbilts about whom she had read ever had anything quite so stylish. And then Margaret's dress was to be made and all the wedding to be planned. Margaret said she had her heart set on a navy blue silk with white ruching, and her mother stopped her. "Don't you," Abby was wistful, "don't you wish we could afford a white satin dress and white slippers and a veil?" "No, Mother. The navy blue silk is just what I want. As long as Fred and I are going right to the rooms over the drugstore, I want my clothes to be suitable, and I might never have use for a white satin again. Besides, now that I'm going to live in Lincoln, I want to save every penny toward painting supplies. I'm never happier than when I'm opening the paint box and getting at the oil and brushes. You know, Mother, my housework won't be much. Just think, those few tiny rooms to keep, and not any of the work there is here on the farm. And I'm going into my painting for all it's worth. I can't explain it to you, Mother, but there's something in me that if I could just get down on canvas the way the cottonwoods look against the sky, or the way the prairie looks at sunset with the pink light." She broke off. "Oh, I suppose you think I'm daffy. You wouldn't understand." Abby, at the east kitchen window, looked over the low rolling hills where the last of May sunshine lay in yellow-pink pools on the prairie. Her lips trembled a little. "Yes, I would," she said simply. "I'd understand." And then, quite suddenly, it was the night of the wedding. The moon slipped up from a fleecy cloud bed and with silvery congratulations swung low over the farmhouse behind the cedars. The whole countryside was there. In a community where there have been few lines drawn, one does not begin to draw them at wedding times. The lane road held all manner of vehicles: lumber wagons, buggies, phaetons, carts, surreys, and hay racks. The Lutzes were all there, and all of the Reinmullers but Emil, who sat on a milk stool in the barn at home all evening and sulked. Sarah Lutz looked stylish in her tight-fitting black dress of stiff silk, with jet earrings against her rosy cheeks. Christine had a new blue calico gathered full on at the waistline. Max surprised them all by driving up the lane road in a shining black buggy with canary yellow wheels, yellow lines over the horse's black back, and a yellow whip. He drove over to the Lutzes and came back with Emma Lutz, trying her best not to look important. The presents were all in the sitting room, the small things on tables. There were 2 red plush chairs, a stylish caster, a green glass pitcher with frosted glasses, 3 lamps with snow scenes on the globes, several handmade splashers and tidies, and enough cold meat and pickle forks to supply a garrison of soldiers with fighting equipment. Gus and Christine, out of deference to the literary tastes of the family, had bought a huge volume, their decision over the purchase having been based upon weight rather than content, and which now, upon inspection, proved to be 20 lessons in etiquette. Some time before the ceremony, Abby climbed the uncarpeted pine stairs with the little calfskin-covered chest under her arm, just as her mother had climbed the sapling ladder in the old log cabin. She was thinking, wasn't life queer? Such a little while ago it seemed. Where had the time gone? Blown away by the winds you could not stop, ticked off by the clock hands that you could not stay. Margaret was nearly dressed. Her blue silk with its 15 yards of goods was looped back modishly over a bustle, the train dragging behind her with a stylish abandon. Abby sat down on the edge of her daughter's bed, the chest in her lap. You know, Margaret, it was always kind of a dream of mine that by the time you were married, we'd be well enough off to do a lot of things for you. I always saw you in my mind dressed in white with a veil and slippers. Not just that I wanted you dressed that one way, but I mean as a sort of symbol. That we'd be able to do all the things for you that should rightfully go with the pearls. But Abby's voice broke a little and she stopped to steady it. Things don't always turn out just as we dream, and we're not able to do much for you. But anyway, you shall wear the pearls tonight if you want to. Margaret, holding up her long dress, crossed the rag-carpeted floor in little swift, happy steps and threw her young arms around her mother. I know all you've done for me, Mother. She took Abby's rough hands in her own firm ones and held them to her lips. And it's everything, just everything that you could do. Never as long as I live can I ever repay it. There were tears in the young girl's eyes, and to keep them back, she said lightly, No thanks, Mother dear. I'm all right with my lovely blue silk and the white silk ruching at my neck. Keep them for Isabel or baby Grace. You and Father will be well fixed in a few years. The land will be higher. You're having good crops now, and by the time Isabel is married, your dream can come true. And besides, Mother dear, she put her young cheek against Abby's, you know that when you marry the man you love, you don't need jewels to make you happy. Yes, yes, how the words came back, borne on the breeze of memories. How swiftly the clock hands had gone round. Abby could not speak. So she only patted her and kissed her, smiling through 1,000 unshed tears. And you who have seen your mother smile when you left her, or have smiled at your daughter's leaving, know it is the most courageous smile of all. And then it was time to go downstairs. Margaret and young Dr. Fred Baker came down the enclosed pine stairway and across the parlor, Margaret's silk dress dragging stylishly over the red and green spirals of the sail carpet. Isabel pedaled and played the wedding march lustily, the sound of the wind pumping into the reeds rather prominent above the melody. A solemn hush fell on the friends gathered from all the farms in the little village. Abby stood by Will, who was holding Grace in his arms. John was at the other side. Mac sauntered over and stood by Emma Lutz. Isabel stopped playing, and the voice of the preacher came hurtling against the silence. Inasmuch as we are gathered together. Abby thought she could not stand it. She must call out in one great scream that she could not let her little girl go away from her. For better or worse. Oh, God, don't let Margaret have to go through all the hardships I did. Until death do you part. They were speaking of death again. Why did they always talk about death when there was only life before them? Do you take this man? And now Abby was going to break down and cry. She threw up her head. No, not a tear, not a single tear. If she started, she would turn into a Niobe to weep herself to death. And then quite suddenly, Margaret Deal was Mrs. Fred Baker. After that, with Isabel pumping away faithfully, if windily, on the blue Danube walls, and by the blue Alsatian mountains, some of the young folks danced on the new sail carpet, with the straw underneath working itself up into little hummocks. There were biscuits and pressed chickens, cakes and lemonade out on the side porch. Christine Reinmuller and Sarah Lutz took turns in shaking the fly brush with its long paper streamers over the tables so that no unusual number of flies would light on the food. Everyone had a grand and glorious time. There was only one queer thing about the whole affair: a new dish among the refreshments which no one in the community had served before. Men folk going home asked their wives why in Sam Hill the potatoes were all cold, and their wives said to hush and not to show their ignorance, that it was something new called potato salad, and it was supposed to be cold. At which most of the men laughed long and raucously and said by golly, for their part, they'd take theirs hot, fried, or baked in their skins. And back on the porch of the farmhouse behind the cedars, Abby Deal stood and watched her married daughter drive away under the starlit summer sky. Then she turned and went into the kitchen and wound the old Seth Thomas clock with the little brown church painted on its glass.